Hello learners and welcome back to this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. In the previous lecture, I had referred to the American poet Walt Whitman. I will briefly continue this discussion before transitioning towards a discussion of reverse colonization and other thematic analyses of the novel. The reference to Walt Whitman is a signal for one particular series of themes as well as analyses of this novel that refers to the theme of sexuality, particularly the repressed and deviant sexuality that was a very big reality of Bram Stoker's life. We will briefly refer to the theoretical work of Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick in order to better understand why sexuality was important and how sexuality can be such a powerful force that shapes the themes as well as the form of this novel, that is Bram Stoker's Dracula. In the year 1990, Eve Sedgwick published what is in some ways among the most influential scholarly works in queer studies, the book that's titled Epistemology of the Closet. And I'll briefly read out a very important quote from this book. Sedgwick writes, and I quote, "There is a radical uncertainty closeted gay people are likely to feel about who is in control of information about their sexual identity. No one person can take control over all the multiple, often contradictory, codes by which information about sexual identity and activity can seem to be conveyed." Now, this quote reveals and helps us understand exactly what is so powerful and persuasive about Eve Sedgwick's work and why this particular thought, the epistemology of the closet, is important and can be useful for us when we try to understand what is happening and how we can appreciate Bram Stoker's Dracula. So what Sedgwick is writing is saying is that the fact that many human beings are forced to conceal their true identity is not just or not merely and not simply and not obviously a source of discomfort, shame, pain, and general unpleasantness for the human beings concerned. That all of those things are true. The fact that many human beings are forced to live in secret is obviously a source of great discomfort and is one of the major problems with societies. That is obvious and does not require such a scholarly analysis to be understood. In fact, what Sedgwick is writing is related to, but a little bit different from, what I just described. Sedgwick is writing that the enforced secrecy actually has a productive consequence. That is what the word epistemology in the title means. The closet is a reality and it has material consequences. It produces effects on the quality of lives that people live. However, it also has epistemic consequences. That is, it is a source of knowledge. It is a source of new forms of writing, thinking, and even feeling. How can that be? If you think about it, this is a somewhat counterintuitive and somewhat contradictory idea. Isn't the closet universally acknowledged to be a bad thing? The fact that many people are forced to live in secrecy, isn't that a bad thing? Yes, of course it's a bad thing. It's a source of discomfort and shame. However, given that there are no alternatives to coming out, given that the closet is a reality, there has evolved a culture of living, writing, thinking, and feeling that emerges from the fact of the closet. And this source of shame can actually become a little bit complicated and turn into a source of uncertainty, which ultimately leads to new ways of writing and thinking. Now, attentive learners will have noticed in what I have just said that this idea, and in the particular form that I have given it in my explanation of it, reflects a way of thinking that derives from the work of Michel Foucault. Power is productive of knowledge. We have seen this in the work of Edward Said's Orientalism, and we see this again in the work of Eve Sedgwick, where the closet is not simply a source of discomfort, but also the occasion and the source of new ways of writing and thinking. How can we understand Bram Stoker's novel Dracula as a consequence of the ways of writing, thinking, and feeling that Stoker's closeted identity produced? That is what we will understand in the next few minutes. Now, it's useful to remember some facts. In 19th century England, homosexuality was illegal and it was punishable by law. Now, because of this legal situation, a lot of men who harbored tendencies of affection and love towards other men evolved a code of recognition. This code of recognition allowed for some expression of truth and individuality while also extending a degree of protection from these laws which would make their behavior and the expression of their identity punishable. What was this code like and how was this code created? This code referred to a lot of cultural and literary and intellectual practices, right? So by writing in a certain way, by talking in a certain way, by using the references of certain iconic traditions, writers, texts, a kind of signal could be sent and a kind of expression of identity could be achieved, which also protected those individuals who were expressing themselves in this way. And one example of a cultural reference which allowed for this kind of messaging, this kind of secret, safe, and secure form of identity to be expressed was the work of the American poet Walt Whitman. Now, Walt Whitman was widely successful, widely read, hugely successful poet, and was also unique among the writers of his time, and definitely writers of 19th century America and Europe, in the extent to which he had let the public know of his sexual leanings. That is to say, he had towed the line further than others and had made enough references towards his identity and had referred to his identity in sufficient ways to make it clear that he belonged to a particular sort of leanings which were not normative. Right? In this way, Walt Whitman was quite unique. Now, it just so happens, and it is not a coincidence, but it is a fact that Bram Stoker made time and put in effort to meet Walt Whitman and wrote several letters, many of which are deeply revelatory and personal letters. In these letters, Bram Stoker made several telling comments, and I'm going to read out only a few quotes. There are many such letters. I do not have time to go into each of them, and I will not be reading entire sentences or paragraphs, but some key quotes, phrases, which reveal something very unique and powerful about sexuality, its repression, and how this repressed sexuality produced new ways of writing and thinking. In one letter, Bram Stoker writes, "I would like to call you comrade." Right? In another letter, Stoker declares that he wishes to talk to Walt Whitman, quote, "as men who are not poets do not often talk," unquote. In one letter, Stoker writes to Whitman, saying that Whitman has taken off his shackles, but he, that is Stoker, has shackles still. Stoker also declares that he is not prepared to give up all else, right? That Stoker appreciates that Whitman has taken some risks and those risks have paid off. That is, Whitman has declared his identity in a certain way, but Stoker is not prepared to make those choices. Finally, in several letters, Stoker writes to Whitman and describes as both of them, both himself as well as the addressee of his letters, both Bram Stoker and Walt Whitman, as individuals who belong to a particular kind. Right? So Stoker writes this phrase, my kind, several times. All of these phrases, which I've just quoted, demonstrate one thing, that is, that in this time, that is in the 1870s, Bram Stoker declared himself as a member of the same kind as Walt Whitman. Right? And these were not public letters, these were private documents, but still it goes a long way to demonstrate how Bram Stoker thought of himself in reference to being of a certain kind and feeling certain tendencies, feeling certain inclinations. And the fact that Stoker felt these inclinations put him in a particular community. Right? He was very openly accepting these facts in the 1870s. However, in the early 1900s, that is in the early 20th century, his attitude, that is Bram Stoker's attitude towards sexuality, had undergone a radical shift. Famously, in the year 1912, Bram Stoker demanded imprisonment of and punishment for writers who either declared their own or described in their fiction that of others deviant forms of sexuality. How can we understand this radical shift? One very persuasive answer to this question is provided by the scholar Talia Schäfer, who has written a brilliant paper in the journal ELH, or English Literary History, which was published in the year 1994 and is also the source for most of the facts and interpretations presented in this discussion of Dracula. The full bibliographical details of this paper are on the screen. Those who are interested may please feel free to look it up and study this in its full detail on their own time. According to Schaeffer, the difference between these two positions, that is, one in which Bram Stoker declared himself to be a member of this secret underground radical group, and the other position in which Bram Stoker called for public imprisonment and punishment of homosexual writers, can be understood as the difference between the two ways Bram Stoker understood and practiced secrecy. In the first, Stoker felt the pressure and the stress of maintaining the secrecy of his sexuality. The same stress of maintaining secrecy also produced the pleasure of divulging the secret in a safe space. That is, an example of this pleasurable divulgence of the secret can be found in Stoker's letters to Walt Whitman, from which I have just quoted. In the second position, however, this secrecy and the pleasure and the stress associated with secrecy have transformed into something else. In the second stage, Stoker had reached a position where he had carefully funneled his secrets, if indeed they could be called that, into his writing. So he is no longer personally carrying the burden of the secret of his sexuality, and he's no longer giving himself the indulgence of revealing the secret in personal communications. The secret of his sexuality has been transformed into his writing. We can describe it by understanding that the emotional burden of those secrets was now carried not by Bram Stoker himself as a person, but rather by the fictional characters of his novels, chiefly Dracula. In this stage, to use the language of secrets, there were no secrets to reveal in the first place, because the information that was secret in the earlier stage had now been translated into harmless outlets. So the expression of a secret would no longer cause any outrage or harm or ill repute to Stoker as a person. The feelings could be attributed to fictional characters. This was also the time when Stoker dropped Oscar Wilde's name from his autobiographical writings. After this brief discussion of how sexuality structures the forms of writing, as well as the theme and the structure of the novel Dracula, we will return briefly to a discussion of literary history and how the theme of reverse colonization was a very frequently described event and a trope in many contemporary works of fiction. We will discuss reverse colonization through the lens of Stephen Arata's work, Fictions of Loss, and we will return to the discussion of Stoker's sexuality and the displacement of secrets onto Stoker's fiction a little bit later in this course. I will continue with the discussion of the context and also begin reading the novel and tracking how a few important themes are developed in this novel. So, the period that we are now studying in the Victorian era, it is known as the turn of the century, and very specifically, it refers to the last decade of the 19th century, the 1890s. The literature that was published in this time, and especially the novels that were published in this decade, they are described by a very succinct and accurate phrase, and that phrase is fictions of loss. This is a phrase that's coined by the scholar Stephen Arata in his 1996 book, Fictions of Loss in Fin de Siècle Victorian England. Now, it's important to understand a little bit about what Arata means by this phrase, fictions of loss, if we are to achieve an accurate, thorough, and perceptive understanding and appreciation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, I will focus on what this phrase means, delineate what fictions means, what loss means, and finally, why does it matter? Let us try and understand what loss means and what loss came to mean to writers, scholars, and readers who are concerned with this period of Victorian writing. The kinds of loss that writers and readers were occupied with can be described as anxieties and feelings attached to imminent decline. Whether it was real or not, we don't know, but it was felt that some forms of decline were imminent. This decline had three common manifestations. It was national, biological, and aesthetic. In the aesthetic sphere, there was a sense that the culture that was prevalent, the culture of writing, reading, poetry, music, etc., cultural productions that were in vogue in the middle of the 19th century, these aesthetic texts would be in a state of decline. In the national sphere, it was felt that England's global influence was something that would decline. England had reached the peak of imperial power at some point in the latter half of the 19th century, but as the century drew to a close, due to various rebellions, challenges, dissent in a lot of English colonies, it was felt that England's power on a global scale might be declining. That was the second form of decline which had caused a sense of anxiety and which inspires Stephen Arata to call this period a period when writers and readers were occupied with a sense of loss. The third and final form of decline which created this sense of loss was biological. It was felt that the Anglo-Saxon race was undergoing a form of decay, a decay which was quite possibly fatal. It was a physical, moral, spiritual, and creative decay. So these were the three kinds of declines which created a very powerful sense that the last decade of the 19th century was a period in which a great deal of loss was taking place, and writers could not but describe this loss in their work. Now, where did this sense of anxiety come from? Or why was it that writers and readers perceived that there was this decline? It was not that the decline was happening, but there was a great deal of scholarship, a great deal of writing, which influenced people to think that there was a lot of decline. And the most dominant form of intellectual work which produced this sense that decline was real can be called degeneration theory. A scholar who helped create this sense was Benedict Augustin Morel, a French scholar who combined biology with cultural criticism. Politically, this was a form of writing which catered to the bourgeoisie or the middle classes. These were economically secure groups who had begun to feel a little bit insecure about the longevity of the comfort and security they currently enjoyed. And degeneration theory catered to this anxiety, fed this anxiety by making frequent jumps between the individual biological condition of a degenerate body and the state of decay of society at large. Right? The individual, it's him or herself, may be degenerate, but the concern of these scholars, like Benedict Augustine Morel, was the cause and effect of that individual degeneracy. The causes that Morel wrote about were poverty, malnutrition, prostitution, crime, alcoholism, and pollution. These were the things which caused individuals to grow degenerate. Mind you, these are all social causes. These are things that exist in society. However, the influence of these social forces is that individuals grow degenerate. Finally, the effects of individual degeneracy could also be felt in society, in a collective group. Some of these effects included sterility, madness, imbecility, suicide, and revolution. Now, there was also a difference between degeneration theory as it existed in Europe and as it had come to be perceived in England. Now, the thinker I just named, that is Morel, was from France. There was an Italian thinker by the name of Cesare Lombroso. In contrast, however, there were no dominant writers or thinkers in England. There was a lack of a sharply defined school of thought concerning degeneracy in England. Instead, what we had in England was the presence of degeneration theory as a commonsensical idea. And an example of that can be found in the 1895 trial during Oscar Wilde's obscenity trials, in which many London-based newspapers tried to explain Oscar Wilde's behavior by citing a book that was published recently. This book was Max Nordau's book, Degeneration. Now, in addition to the presence of these ideas, there was also something else which grew in late Victorian and specifically the last decade of the Victorian era. This was the rise of the professional reader in fiction and the rise of a hermeneutical style of knowledge. What does this mean? This means that scientists, writers, and observers of all kinds found patterns in observable phenomena. And through the finding of patterns, it was felt that a kind of solution can be found to the chaos of contemporary society. A clear example of that can be seen in the work of Sigmund Freud, in which one solution or one possible way of coping or dealing with the suffering or the discomfort produced by the psychological condition, by the unknowable psychology of human beings, was to find patterns, was to create narrative, a logical narrative, or to describe in a particular way what was only perceived in terms of its effects. So just like Freud created diagrammatic structure of the unconscious, and through such a diagrammatic structure proceeded to provide a way of coping with some of the uncontrollable effects of psychology, there were other experts in late Victorian England who created patterns and through these patterns provided solutions to contemporary problems. Who were these experts and what disciplines did they come from? These were all new and rising disciplines, disciplines which would grow to become much more powerful, but which in the Victorian era were very weak and in a very nebulous state. These disciplines included medicine, psychiatry, anthropology, criminology, and literary criticism. In late Victorian novels, we find a lot of these professional readers. These readers take the form of characters, such as detectives, doctors, scholars, and scientists. Many detective novels actually feature amateur scientists and doctors who, by virtue of their ability to find patterns, by virtue of their ability to closely study and analyze everyday reality, they catch details which others might have missed. And through their ability to catch these details and to piece together narratives of what they observe, they are able to solve crimes. In Dracula, we have two such readers. One is our hero or protagonist named Jonathan Harker, who travels to Transylvania and undergoes a very painful experience and ultimately succeeds in vanquishing the evil that Count Dracula is. Jonathan Harker is one such observer and professional reader. Another such observer and professional reader, and in some ways much sharper, much more keener than Jonathan Harker, is Count Dracula himself. Further, the kind of fiction that we understand when we use this phrase, fictions of loss, we refer to popular fiction. Now, there is a particular relationship between dominant ideology and popular fiction. Now, it has long been believed that popular fiction simply reproduces the dominant ideology of its time. And the reason this belief exists in a lot of scholarly work is because of 20th century Marxism. However, there are other streams of thought, other schools of scholarly work, including cultural studies, which argues that there is actually a very complicated relationship between popular culture and dominant ideology. In fact, we can actually understand this better if we understand ideology through the definition provided by the scholar Frederick Jameson. Jameson's definition of ideology is an imaginary solution to real social problems. Now, in this phrase, imaginary solutions, all of literary and cultural production can be put and understood. So, it is possible to study all literary work, whether popular or serious, as having an interventionist role in ideology. And this is best exemplified in popular fiction, much more so than serious or literary fiction. This is because in popular fiction there are certain demands of the genre, there are certain conventions, there are certain expectations that readers who are likely to buy and consume popular fiction expect it to adhere to. Because of these pressures of the convention, popular fiction manages to perform an ideological role that is much more complex. It is impossible for a work of popular fiction to simply reproduce an ideology. In fact, any ideological work that a work of popular fiction might perform is always routed through or deflected through or refracted through the expectations and conventions of the genre. So in this course, the ideology of the late Victorian period is understood not through serious or literary fiction, but through popular fictions, works such as Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray or Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And Bram Stoker's Dracula forms a trinity, a sort of very important set of three texts which were very popular, but which also performed a great deal of very important intellectual work. Contemporary works that some readers were also reading at this time include novels by Joseph Conrad or Henry James. Now, these two writers, Conrad and James, are different because they were read by fewer readers, were written with a very much more serious intention. They had much more self-conscious aesthetic and artistic goals, other than simply entertaining readers who would want to buy a lot of copies of these books. So these popular fictions perform the ideological role of reflecting and giving readers and writers a chance to introspect on some of the powerful themes and concerns of the time. Now, coming to Dracula now, it's important to note that Victorian fiction has had a very complicated relationship to foreign bodies. Foreign bodies, or individuals from foreign countries, that is, men, women, children, human beings of all genders, ages, races, etc. Human beings who come from spaces outside of Victorian England. These are foreign bodies. Now, Victorian fiction used to have one particular way of dealing with foreign bodies in the first half of the 19th century. This relationship can be understood as one in which foreign bodies are sent away. That is, they are sent from England to outside England, and they end up in a place that is happy and productive, both for themselves as well as for England. One way to understand this is to think of some examples. The character of St. John Rivers in Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, or the character of Pip in Great Expectations. Now, these are characters who have professional, financial, or other kinds of mercantile interests outside England, whether it refers to missionary work in India or refers to gaining profit or wealth from mines in Australia. These are characters who have their origin within Victorian England, but they go outside England. They leave and they settle, they emigrate to foreign shores. And the result of this movement from England to outside England is that it leads to well being, professional, financial well being, both individual as well as social. The nation of England and Victorian society in general benefits financially and politically from the imperial, political, as well as financial work that these characters do when they leave England and go abroad. St. John Rivers campaigns against sati and helps legitimize the value of British rule in the colonial space of India. Pip, by extracting mines and generating wealth, sends money back to England and helps consolidate England's place in the global landscape of 19th and 20th centuries in the world. So this is one story. This is one way of understanding how foreign bodies are treated in the first half of the Victorian period. They move outward. Now, in the second half of the Victorian period, we need to understand that foreign bodies move inward. Now, if not the entire second half of the Victorian period, we must notice that in the last decade, in the fictions that we are concerned with in this part of the course, these foreign bodies move inward. And some examples of this can be found in the work of the popular fiction writer H. Rider Haggard and the popular science fiction novelist H.G. Wells. I will focus on H. Rider Haggard's novel from 1887, the novel titled She, A Story of Adventure, and then focus on other writers and other ideas in the next lecture. In Rider Haggard's novel She, a character named Aisha decides to come to England to overthrow the sovereign Victorian monarch, that is Queen Victoria. Now, other characters respond to this plan and this proposal and this decision with a great deal of fear. They are convinced that if this character named Aisha decides to follow through with her plan, that is, if she decides to go to England and try and overthrow Queen Victoria, then she will succeed and she will rule over England and through that the rest of the world. So instead of questioning it, characters are likely to believe that England was in a way ready for colonization by outside forces. Instead of thinking that Queen Victoria could defeat or resist these outside forces, characters in the novel believed that England was at a time or at a place in which it was susceptible to reverse colonization. This is a concept, reverse colonization, that we will discuss further, and we will see how the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker is a powerful articulation of the fears as well as the strategies that writers and characters thought of in response to the fear of what would happen if reverse colonization were to take place in Victorian England. Thank you.